The death of Ivan Ilyich is one of the peaks of world psychological prose. Tracing the thoughts and feelings of a painfully dying official, Tolstoy shows how a person runs away from thoughts about death, and how upcoming death leads him to understanding what his life actually was. From the first pages till the end of the novel, it's a chronicle of illness and death of an official, preceded by the story of his life. It's the only work of its kind that tells how a person experiences the approach of the end, what psychological tricks he uses to dodge the realization of its inevitability, and how he finally realizes that death is the most important thing in life, which completely changes the understanding of life itself. The death of Ivan Ilyich were written by Leo Tolstoy in a very specific period of his life. Beginning of the 1880s was the time of a spiritual revolution. He already is a figure with global influence, the author of War and Peace and Anna Karenina. Now he reviving his own life, formulating the ideas that will form the basis of Tolstoyan movement. The idea of the story about the simple death of a simple man dates back to the 1881. Its original title is Death of a Judge. But the idea of the story remains unrealized for a long time. On April 27, 1884, Tolstoy writes in his diary, "I want to start and finish something new, either the death of a judge or the notes of a madman." Notes in his diaries show that some outline of the story already existed by that time. The final version of the text is dated March 25, 1886. It's the same year it was published. Tolstoy's previous works were touched by reflections of the meaning of death, from early diary entries to the scene of death of Knyaz Andrei in War and Peace, from the story Three Deaths to Confession, and of course his religious and philosophical writings of the 1880s. The writing of this story was certainly influenced by illness and death of Tolstoy's familiar Ivan Mechnikov, the prosecutor of the Tula court. He also was affected by the death of his close people, Ivan Turgenev and Knyaz Leonid Urusov. In the very first reviews appearing in the letters and diaries of people of his time, Death of Ivan Ilyich is regarded as one of the peaks of Tolstoy's work and world literature at all. Vladimir Stasov writes to Tolstoy on April 25, 1886, "Not a single nation, anywhere in the world has such a brilliant creation. Everything is small, everything is weak and pale in comparison with these 70 pages." Pyotr Tchaikovsky writes in his diary on July 12, 1886, "I read The Death of Ivan Ilyich. More than ever, I am convinced that the greatest of all former writers and artists ever and anywhere is Leo Tolstoy. It alone is enough for a Russian person not to bow his head in shame where they calculate before him all the greatest things that Europe has given to mankind." Vladimir Nabokov, in his lectures on Russian literature, calls the novel Tolstoy's brightest, most perfect and most complex work. The experiences of alienation, abandonment, tragic absurdity covering a person on the verge of death will become the subject of research by existentialist philosophers such as Martin Heidegger. The motives of the story will be continued in a variety of works dealing with death. Chekhov in the story The Bishop will return to experiencing death as liberation. Bunin in The Gentleman from San Francisco will again show how death makes the unusual everyday existence meaningless. For Kafka and his Metamorphosis and modernist literature at all, Tolstoy's work influence cannot be overrated. Thoughts about death presented in all of Tolstoy's diaries, his novels, journalistic and philosophical works. It's impossible to reconcile with the thought of death. The person's ego is not able to imagine and accept the inevitability of destroying itself. And at the same time, the thought of death pulls us out of the circle of everyday life and returns us to the main questions. Why do we live? What should we do? What is the main meaning and justification of life? The thought of death is associated with the psychological crisis which changed Tolstoy's life, his views on the world and his relationship with literature. The beginning of the crisis can be considered the so-called Arzamas horror, experienced by Tolstoy on September 1, 1869, on the way to the Penza province when he was going to acquire an estate. Tolstoy describes this episode in the unfinished novel Notes of a Madman. In the middle of the night, in a small hotel in Arzamas, he experiences the inexplicable fear. and at the same time feels the physical presence of death. What kind of stupidity is this? I said to myself. What am I afraid of? Me, answered the voice of death inaudibly. I'm here. The realization of the inevitability of death makes Tolstoy seek salvation in religion, and then leads to the faults of its imperfection, of the need to correct and purify Christianity. Here are the origins of the socio-moral doctrine which became known as Tolstoyan movement. In the face of death, a person comes to the need to abandon any form of possessions and power, which the state, civilization and culture bring with them. All our actions, reasoning, science, art, all this appeared to me as pampering. I realized that it's impossible to look for meaning in this. The actions of the working people who create life appear to me as a single real deed, and I realized that the meaning given to this kind of life is the truth, and I accepted it. On September 7, 1885, Tolstoy writes in his diary, "Recently I feel death very closely. It seems that material life is hanging by a thread and should end very soon. More and more I get used to it, and I begin to feel, not pleasure, but the interest of waiting. This is the end and nothing more," one of the last phrases that Tolstoy says before his death. In these and many other statements of the late Tolstoy, it's no longer fear, but humility and acceptance of death, similar to what Ivan Ilyich Golovin, the hero of Tolstoy's story, experiences in the last seconds of his life. Tolstoy is infinitely attentive to the process of dying. A slow change in sensations, a reassessment of values, a restructuring of the picture of the world. All these changes can be reduced to one. The approach of death pulls us out of an ordinary semi-automatic existence, makes us see ourselves, people around us and our own life in a new way, and face the last truths of being. The dying Ivan Ilyich ceases to understand what previously seemed obvious, feels his own body as someone else, feels the lies and falsity of the usual way of life. After the first appointment with the doctor, Ivan Ilyich looked at the world with different eyes. Everything seemed sad to Ivan Ilyich on the streets. The cabbies were sad, the houses were sad, the passers-by, the shops were sad. A picture of ordinary life appears in an unusual light. Ivan Ilyich starts to see the world with the observer's point of view, with the new death. Ivan Ilyich is trying to return to the circle of everyday life. He begins to strictly follow the doctor's instructions, but an attempt to restart the mechanics of everyday existence doesn't work and it leads him to despair. Painful sensations increasingly alienate him from his loved ones, who continue to fulfill their usual life routine. He begins to feel a lie in their everyday actions, including in the cold care of him. And finally he is faced with the realization of the inevitable. I will not be, so what will be? Nothing will happen. So where will I be when I'm gone? Is it death? The upcoming death brings Ivan Ilyich back to himself. He can no longer perceive himself as just one of the ordinary people. Death is not what happens to others, it happens directly to him, and puts him before the question, what is his true I? He walks through the memories and impressions of his life, and finds the real only in the memory of childhood. It always began from the nearest time and came down to the most distant, to childhood, and stopped there. Time begins to flow differently. Whether it was morning, evening, Friday, Sunday, it was all the same. Everything was the same. Aching, not stopping for a moment, excruciating pain, consciousness of a hopelessly departing life, the same dreadful, hateful death approaching, which alone was reality and still the same lie. What's the meaning of the days, weeks and hours of the day? This stop time is filled with the experience of physical pain and total meaninglessness. Lying almost all the time with his face to the wall, he alone suffered all the same unresolved suffering and thought all the same unresolved thought. What is this? Is it really true that death? And the inner voice answered, yes, it is true. Why these tortures? And the voice answered, no reason. Beyond that, there was nothing else. Only on the very threshold of death he accepts the idea that his life was not right. He is able to pity his relatives, to free himself from the illusion of his own infinite significance. and accepting his own death, Ivan Ilyich conquers death. Death is over, he said to himself, it is no more. The past story of Ivan Ilyich's life was simplest and most ordinary and the most terrible. This phrase in the story begins the biography of Ivan Ilyich. The fate of Ivan Ilyich is only a particular example of a general principle. His life is terrible to the same extent as the life of any person who lives like everyone else. He cried about his helplessness, about the terrible loneliness, about the cruelty of people, about the cruelty of God, about the absence of God. The life of Ivan Ilyich is shaped by various forces: the order established in society, the formal machine of legal proceedings, the unwritten rules of decency, and the tastes of his environment, but not by himself. When the wife demands attention to herself, Ivan Ilyich moves away from her and goes into that sphere of life where he can follow the routine without efforts. As the wife became more demanding, Ivan Ilyich more and more endured the core of his life in his work. In the end, the main joy of his life becomes an occupation, to the highest degree associated with the senselessness killing of time. The joys of his service were the joy of pride. Public joys were the joys of vanity, but the real joys of Ivan Ilyich were the joys of playing cards. The decoration of the apartment, his latest passion, is again associated exclusively with the decorative side of life, and this decoration still obeys the surrounding tastes and ideas, but not his own. What Ivan Ilyich experiences on the verge of death can be compared with instant enlightenment in Zen Buddhism. Things suddenly open up to him with their true side. The past life reveals its true meaning. What happened to him was the same that sometimes happens in the train, when you think that you are going forward, but you are going back, and suddenly you find out the real direction. What seemed pleasant and decent in a previous life is now experienced as false, and the real direction is felt only in memories from childhood. The fear of death creates a situation in which Ivan Ilyich realizes the true value of life. If there were no disease, he would not have the opportunity to get out of semi-automatic existence. Existentialist philosophers, in particular Karl Jaspers, will write a lot about limit situations that tear a person out of the sphere of everyday life and return him to true being. All these situations, whether it be a sudden illness, a mental shock, or an act of self-sacrifice, are united by the experience of the finiteness of life. This experience creates a new scale of values that allows you to rebuild life, to find in it something that will not be destroyed by suffering and death. But in some cases, like in the case of Ivan Ilyich, the limit situation doesn't always leave time for such a spiritual revolution. At the same time, Tolstoy writes about the fear of death as a state that must be overcome. In his later writings, Tolstoy describes this fear as a manifestation of selfishness, a projection of the human ego, which is occupied only with itself. He writes, "The fear of death comes only from the fear of losing the good of life with its death. If a person could place his good in the good of other beings, that is, if he loved them more than himself, then death would not appear to him as the end of good and life, as it appears to a person who lives only for himself." It's this understanding of life that is revealed to Ivan Ilyich to the threshold of death. Life for others, love and compassion for loved ones is the only right thing that is revealed before leaving. The final scene of death of Ivan Ilyich can be interpreted in another way. Ivan Ilyich comes not only to true content of life, but also to the meaning of death. He accepts death and thereby frees himself from fear and, in a sense, from death itself. He who is not afraid to die cannot die. He recognizes that death is not a punishment and belongs to the order of the world, writes the Hungarian literary critic Zoltán Hajnadi. It's a law that all men are subject to. No man is immortal, it's impossible to live life alive. Having recognized this, he is immediately freed from the fear of death. He becomes free. So freedom is not at the beginning, but at the end.